Wouldn't it be great if Christians could talk about the Bible and various issues without fighting or arguing or name-calling? Imagine if we could just sit down, have a cup of coffee, discuss, and even if we disagree, treat each other with respect. That's what this podcast is all about: kind, loving Christian conversations. It's not a sermon or a Bible class. It's just followers of Jesus talking about life and faith. I hope this show encourages you to have conversations like this with people in your life. I'm Wes McAdams, and I want to welcome you to the CrossTalk podcast. On today's episode, I had the opportunity to sit down with my friend Scott Elliott, the minister for the Grange Church of Christ. He wrote a blog post entitled, "Should Christians Watch R-Rated Movies?" And I thought he had some excellent thoughts. So I invited him to join me on the podcast to discuss the movies Christians watch. What value do movies have for Christians? What movies should Christians avoid? And should adults watch movies that they won't let their children watch? These are some of the things that we discuss. I think you'll be challenged and encouraged by this conversation. Okay, well, Scott, I appreciate you having this conversation with me. I'm excited about it. I read your blog post that you wrote, I guess it's been several years ago, but should Christians watch R-rated movies? And that's something I think we'll talk about as the conversation goes on. But I thought we would start with just a fun question and ask you, what are your favorite movies? Maybe your top 5 favorite movies.
Okay, yeah, that's a difficult question, and it changes.
I know, huh? I'm glad it's me asking you instead of you asking me.
So there are some that I thought about that, don't change. I mean, one of my favorite films for several years now has been The Tree of Life, and it's not an easy film for some people to watch because it's more of an art film, but it's a very Christian film, and I think that it's one that stirred a lot of talk among people, and not just Christians, among a lot of people that are non-Christians, very secular people. In fact, Roger Ebert, who kind of wrestled with faith a little bit, but I think would be classified as a non-believer, he said in his review that it's a form of prayer and that it created a spiritual awareness with him, within him. And it opens with a Job quote, and it's there's some tragedy there, but it's dealing with sort of the mystery of God, and it's a film about life, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful film. Again, it's not the easiest film to watch because it's not a film like we're used to, but it's one of my favorites. I like Dr. Strangelove, which is an older film from the 60s. It was made in 1964, and this was 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's a comedy with Peter Sellers and George C. Scott, a lot of great acting in there, but it's a sort of a satire and is looking at some very serious questions about nuclear arms, the nuclear arms race, and, kind of addressing very serious questions. And how do you do that, especially when you're in the middle of that? Well, you do it as a satire, and you do it as a very dark comedy, and it just beautiful, brilliant film by Stanley Kubrick, who made a lot of other great films as well. Unforgiven, I think, is an interesting one, and this may play into some of the conversation about, should Christians watch R-rated films? This was a film that was directed by Clint Eastwood, stars Clint Eastwood, and of course, I think maybe some younger people don't know, but most everybody knows who Clint Eastwood is, and they're familiar with Dirty Harry, and they're familiar with the Man with the No Name trilogy, the films that he made with Sergio Leone. And what Eastwood does is he makes this Western later in his life when he's in his 60s, and he is imagining what it would be like for some of these characters that he's played over the years, and how he has evolved sort of as an individual. Of course, many of the films that he was in kind of glorified violence. And Unforgiven is a film that's rated R. It's very graphic. And so just kind of up front, if anybody hasn't seen it and wants to see it, it is very graphic. It's an R-rated movie. But it takes a serious look at violence and what does violence do to a person. And violence is not glamorized in this movie. And Eastwood, who plays a gunslinger, is admits to wrongdoing. He doesn't glamorize his past like you see in a lot of Westerns, and he's remorseful about it. And so that's one I love. I think Shawshank Redemption is a great film with many wonderful things in it. You could just go on and on. One of the key things there is, of course, in the title, Redemption. It's a film about identity. It's a film that says a lot about friendship, especially male friendship, which I think is something that, is lacking nowadays. And so it's a film that you could look at because of that. A film about freedom and how do you deal with freedom when you've been in prison for so long. A film about beauty and hope and all those things. And ultimately what it says is that we need, hope, beauty, and friendship. So those are some. I think a fifth one, you might, again, think outside the box a little bit. And there's a lot of great documentaries out there. I know it bothers some people to read subtitles, but I think there's a lot of great foreign films out there. One foreign film you might look into is A Beautiful Life, which is this Italian film made in 1998, and it's set within World War II. And it's a comedy, it's a romance for about the first half of the movie, and then it begins to explore some very deeper subject matter, but it's always doing it with a sense of humor. And there's really nothing bad in the film, but it's one of those films that I probably wouldn't allow my kids to watch until they're quite a bit older, because some of what it's dealing with is the Holocaust, and it doesn't really show any of the atrocities there, but it's not graphic in that way, but that's the background of it. But what's so beautiful about the film is it's about the willingness of a father to sacrifice for his son, and it's just great. So there's a few.
That was a really great list, and it really already touched on so many important things that I think that we're going to get into in the conversation. That movies are far more, and apparently for you especially, that movies are far more than entertainment. We often think about movies just being for entertainment value, and I think sometimes that's the way we have this conversation. Is we just talk about movies as if it was just a matter of sort of unplugging your brain and just doing something to unwind. And I think there is a place for that. But at the same time, you touched on so many things that are incredibly important values and things to think about, things that make you think and help you to think through some really important aspects of being a human being, or even as followers of Jesus, think through some really deep subject matter.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that we really need to think about, and you've hit on it. Okay, what are we doing? Is it entertainment or is it art? And yeah, you're right. There are times when, man, we're just physically and mentally exhausted, and we just maybe want to zone out for a little bit. And I understand that, but I think much of what we need to be taking in should have some type of meaning to it. What we're consuming shouldn't be all mindless entertainment. There's plenty of that out there, but there's a lot of entertainment art that has a lot of meaning behind it, and we need to be consuming that and thinking deeply about it. And there's various reasons for that. It's good for us, but it also opens up conversations with others, Christians and non-Christians alike.
And you really hit on something, especially as you were talking about Unforgiven, that I don't know that a lot of us have taken time to stop and think about, that there's a difference between violence, even that is, pretty explicit, graphic, and violence that glorifies violence. And so, I think sometimes we assume that if a film is violent, or even if a film is graphic in its violence, that it is necessarily glorifying the violence. But sometimes I think the filmmakers, and arguably whether or not, it does this for the audience, but certainly for the filmmakers, I think that they're really trying to paint violence in a negative light and help their audience to wrestle with some of the realities, the dark realities of violence itself.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And now some people can maybe watch Unforgiven and not catch what's going on there, but Eastwood has been very upfront about what he's doing in that film, and that he's looking at what violence does to a person and exploring that, which I think is very helpful. And so I would see a difference in maybe a PG-13 movie that glorifies violence and Unforgiven, which again is very graphic. And I wouldn't show to children at all. It's adult material.
Yeah.
But it's, I think, helpful in exploring what violence does to a person. And, Eastwood just is, and that's not the only theme in there. He's exploring some other things as well. But that's one of the main ones.
Well, and that really kind of leads into the next question of, and I know you touched on this in your blog post, but what do you think when you hear statements like, because I think a lot of Christians, especially even maybe preachers, we make statements like, well, Christians just shouldn't watch R-rated movies or even PG-13 movies, and just make a blanket statement and say Christians shouldn't watch an R-rated movie. What things go through your mind? Maybe not what would you say to that question, but what do you think when you hear kind of blanket statements like that?
Well, there's several things. I think, I guess I'll be a little blunt. I think it's a shallow way of approaching it. And to be fair, maybe people haven't thought about this very deeply. But, well, we just had a movie this year, Unplanned, which is rated R. And I had a minister the other day ask me, because he was thinking about having his youth group watch it. And he asked me about it. And I said, I think that would be good, as long as you gave the caveat to all the parents, say, hey, this is rated R, and it's rated R because it depicts an abortion, But, and just kind of be upfront with the parents. There might be some parents that aren't comfortable with that. There might be others that say, hey, yeah, this would be good viewing. The Passion of the Christ was rated R. Why? Because it's a graphic depiction of the death of Jesus Christ. And there's material within Scripture that is intended for adults. Right. Jewish rabbis recognized this. There were certain books of the Bible, Ezekiel, Song of Solomon, that they said, you know what, until you reach a certain age, you shouldn't read these books. And so I think we should recognize that there is, material that's just for children, and there's material for adults. Now, that doesn't mean that you should go out and watch everything, because there's some stuff out there that people just shouldn't be watching. There's no really value in it. And so you have to be careful. A little background, I don't know if people know this, but the MPAA, which is the Association in America, which gives ratings to film, has evolved over the years. And so, for instance, the rating PG-13 is fairly new. It was only introduced in 1984. And so you'll go back and watch some movies that were rated PG that would not be rated PG today. They'd be rated PG-13. There's a lot of language and violence in them, and it continues to evolve. I mean, one of the reasons why they give a rating to a film nowadays, what you'll see is they'll say this film is rated R, and it's rated R for these reasons. It might have nudity, language, violence. Sometimes they'll say, war violence. It might say cartoon violence. And so then you have to make a decision. Am I okay with cartoon violence? Maybe you're okay with that, but not war violence. One of the reasons they list sometimes is smoking, and so a film could get, bumped a rating, bumped up to PG-13 or bumped up to R just because it depicts people smoking in it. So.
Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting point in your blog post that not all of those things, as Christians, would we see as being equally negative. maybe all of those things we would see as negative to some degree, but not all of those things would we see as equally negative. And as you pointed out earlier, there's a difference between violence and glorifying violence, and the rating system doesn't necessarily differentiate between those things. The rating system is helpful to some degree, but there's really not a lot of differentiation that goes into what makes a movie R-rated or PG-13 or whatever, that would necessarily be on the scale that we would want to use as the only criteria for whether or not we should see a film or whether or not our kids should see a film.
Yeah, and there's also some politics involved in this. Big studios have more pull than independent studios. And so what happens sometimes is big studios can kind of pull their weight and get that PG-13 rating, which means more money for them because more people can see it. And an independent studio might not be able to do that. And so it may get an R rating where it's not as bad as the big studio movie that's rated PG-13. And so we don't realize that either, but there is some politics that if you kind of read some of the stuff going on with movies and everything, you can kind of pick up on this. And there's, some people complain about it, but that's part of it as well. And the other thing we have to think about is as our culture evolves and becomes more secular, some of the things that our culture says is wrong, just kind of like, 20 years ago, smoking wasn't a thing. Now they're saying, well, it's wrong. It shouldn't be depicted in film. Some of the things that we talk about as Christians, they might find objectionable,
And you pointed out something too about and you did in your blog post as well about the even scripture that at one time the rabbis said, until you're 30, you shouldn't read these passages or these books of scripture. And that's sort of something that we probably as Christians today have never even really considered. And part of it, I think, is the way that we've translated certain words and ideas, and some of it, the graphic nature may be sort of hidden under the translation. But at the same time, sometimes it's not. And so, I've struggled even myself with this sometimes, whether or not it's okay for me as an adult Christian to see something that I wouldn't allow my kids to see. I think that sometimes we think, well, if my kids shouldn't see it, is it something that I should see? If they shouldn't be watching it, is it something I should be watching? If they shouldn't listen to this, maybe I shouldn't listen to it either. Do you think a case can be made for pushing back against that idea, that there are some things that as adult Christians, we should be engaging in this conversation or watching this or listening to whatever it may be, whereas we would tell our children, nope, you're not ready for that yet?
Absolutely. So where do we begin? We don't go into our preschool class and say, okay, we're going to study the Song of Solomon now.
Right.
We know that. We understand that there are parts of scripture that were intended for adults. Maybe we haven't thought about that, but the Jewish rabbis certainly thought about it, and I think if we gave it a few minutes and kind of, muled it over, we would understand, there are some things we're not going to teach in the preschool class or the kindergarten class. And and this goes with other areas of life as well. We may be watching the news on television, and getting facts about what's going on in the world. And we might turn off the sound, turn off the TV, or ask our children to leave because the content of the news is something that we don't believe is appropriate for, whatever age our children, are.
Yeah, that's all really, really good, and I think it is intuitive for the most part to think through those things and say, okay, well, this isn't appropriate for them, but I still need to know this information or think through these issues. And I guess maybe we put movies into a certain category because we tend to think of them simply as entertainment. But I think that you've already begun to point out the fact that there is a redeeming value, I think, in movies, and I like the way that you differentiated between it just being entertainment and being art. And I think that maybe for some of us, we haven't really thought about art in that way, that bringing out certain aspects of humanity or life, that it's helpful for us to think through these things and to use art. And movies obviously would just be one type of art that can help us to think through these things. So when it comes to that kind of a thing, what do you think are some, and we've already touched on some of those, but what do you think are some of the redeeming values of movies in general, that even if it is or is not appropriate for kids to watch, why do you think that it is a helpful thing for Christians to see certain films?
There are lots of different reasons. Let me just talk about a few. And again, just say that this doesn't apply to all films. There's certainly films out there that
Right.
Christians, I would say maybe anybody in general shouldn't be watching. But first of all, they're true. I don't care if it's fiction or not. There is truth in fiction, and there is power to story. And that's how we bring meaning to our life. There's a great chapter in G.K. Chesterton's book called The Ethics of Elfland, where he talks about how the truth of fairy tales is better than science, because you're learning sort of ethics and things that you need to know. And there's some of that in film. There are certain movies that really, it's the story behind it that just moves us. And Chesterton wasn't the only one who recognized this. I mean, C.S. Lewis did. That's why he writes the Chronicles of Narnia, that get adapted into film. J.R.R. Tolkien, who does The Lord of the Rings, and those stories, Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, are infused with Christian principles. And so, kind of getting off track a little bit here, but there are certain films that might be rated G or PG that I wouldn't want my child watching. Maybe one example of that is Smallfoot, is a cartoon which basically taught religion is bad, So the content wise, there's no problem with it, but the story, the message that it's giving is certainly bad. There was a point where there was a lot of kind of romantic comedies or romance movies coming out with the idea of a soulmate, and a lot of these would set up where you would have some people married and they wouldn't be happy, and or things wouldn't just be exactly right. And so I'm going to get a divorce and I'm going to go after this other person because I met my soulmate,
Yeah.
And what kind of message is that? And again, it may not have anything content wise bad in the movie, but that's a terrible message to be sending to people. Kind of getting back to your question, what redeeming value do movies have? They're great vehicles for empathy. And so, we get to understand people who have a completely different perspective from our own by watching film. And that may help us do ministry better. It may help us help the person who's sitting next to us in the pew. It may help us love our neighbor better. They are, some of them are filled with beauty. I mean, the Tree of Life is a beautiful film. They send out messages of hope. You think about Shawshank Redemption and how much it's about hope, and also looks at within that film what happens when you don't have any hope. And they're also the language that people speak. And so you think about Paul preaching, and he uses pagan poets to preach. Paul was familiar with the poetry, the art of the day, And so again, what's that similar to in our society? What would be, I think, songs or movies. That's what people are engaging. And some of those movies, if we can speak that language, then we're going to be able to use that to reach people. Again, not all of them. It's not a blanket endorsement to go out and just watch whatever you want. We have to be careful about that. And even the MPAA, even though it's flawed, it does give you sort of some guidelines, say, hey, it does have this content in it. You might want to be careful. But again, I don't think that the MPAA rating is the only thing that we should be looking at, not even maybe the most important thing we should be looking at.
Yeah, man, so many great things that you just mentioned. I mean, it really is incredibly helpful to see, not only to see somebody else's perspective, but also to be sort of shaped by, and I think it is helpful to I've learned so much from movies. I think about the fact that I don't like to just go and unplug my brain, and my wife accuses me of analyzing them too much, and when I get done with the movie I want to talk about it, and I say, well, what were they saying about this, and what do you think that the writer was trying to get across with that? And I had the exact same reaction when I saw Smallfoot. And I've got a couple young kids, and so we watch a lot of movies, and afterwards we'll go over it, together, and think, okay, well, what were they trying to say about this? And it was incredibly disturbing what they were trying to communicate in that movie, or what they were communicating in that movie about the traditions of your elders and the things that are written down. And I mean, to me, it was very obvious the message that they were sending. And so sometimes a movie can be incredibly helpful to teach me, okay, this is true, and maybe you should follow this line of thinking. And in other ways, it helps to reveal what my culture is saying, what they're thinking, what our culture is thinking, and what their hopes are and their dreams are. Even if I disagree with those, as a minister, as a preacher, I want to be able to see these are sort of the messages that our culture believes. You can tell a lot about a culture based on the stories that they tell, the fairy tales that they tell, the movies that they make. And like you said, you mentioned about soulmates, and what we think about love and romance. Not only does life follow art, but art follows life. And if we're going to understand and help people to navigate the truth and impress on them the truth that the gospel gives us, then we've got to sort of understand where they are, what they tend to think, how they tend to think. If we're going to understand why marriages fall apart, we have to understand what their expectations were going into those marriages. If we're going to understand what young people hope to achieve with their life, what their hopes are and their dreams are, then movies help us to navigate those things, both in a positive way, and seeing the positives in the film, but also the negatives in the film that are a reflection of what people are thinking and how they're feeling. And so, yeah, I think, man, I feel like I would miss out. And I respect any Christian who says, listen, I just don't watch movies. My family doesn't watch movies. And that's fine. If that's where you want to be, and, sort of the stance you want to take, I'm fine with that.
Yeah,
Everybody has to make that up. Yeah. But at the same time, I just feel like I would be missing out on so much that the culture is telling us, hey, these are our hopes, these are our dreams, these are our fears. And then to try to understand those so that I can empathize and help people to see how the gospel answers those things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a great gauge of our culture and allows us to have some certain conversations. And so, like, now all the rage is superhero movies,
Yeah.
and there are some good and bad, in that genre. And again, some films that I think are worth watching, some that aren't. But you can look at like a film like Deadpool, which is basically nihilistic and very representative of our secular culture. A very dangerous, I think, film, not just because of content. I mean, that's one thing. It's got horrible content, but also the message behind it is about nihilism. We believe in nothing, very anti-religious. But then you look at like the new Avengers movie, Endgame, which I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but there is a Christ figure within the movie, that you can talk about. And again, we might talk about that weeks down the road, but it gives you something that you can talk about with your Christian friends and your secular friends, some redeeming things in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I left Endgame, and again, no spoilers, but we left that movie and we were talking about the gospel,
Yeah.
and talking about how, whether or not that was what the authors, the writers, the people that made the film, whether or not that was what they were trying to tie it to. Sometimes I think there is an intentional tie-in with the gospel, but sometimes I think that was it C.S. Lewis that said something like, the gospel is the story to which all the other ones point.
Yes.
That I think that there's this underlying truth and hope about redemption and about sacrifice and about love and selflessness that is inherent in humanity, in us. That's something that God put into our hearts, that helps us to make sense of the things that we see in the world, but it also helps us to make sense of the gospel itself. And so, yeah, I think that there's so much value in the conversations that we can have, that movies help to spark those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you don't know whether they do this intentionally or not, but it's something that gets into movies over and over again, especially something like a Christ figure. We don't always realize it, but just go back and you can do some searches like on Google or whatever, and you'd be surprised how many movies have some type of Christ figure in them, or even you see it quite often. That this is more apparent, but sort of the arms outstretched, that gets replayed in movies over and over again, and it's imitating Christ on the cross.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, and this is kind of navigating back to what we were talking about in the beginning about content, but what would you say is some of the criteria that we should use if it's not just a rating system? That you've mentioned, and I totally agree that there are some movies that I think, hey, just don't even bother with that one, or, Deadpool, you brought that one up. I don't know the first thing about it because I've never seen it. And, the content itself would make it just absolutely unwatchable for me. And so what do you think is some of the criteria that we should use for whether or not we watch a movie?
Well, I think you have to look at content, nudity, is much different than language or violence. And there are, especially with a lot of men that wrestle with pornography, lust, all that stuff, then that's something you just need to avoid altogether. Now, not all nudity is the same. I mean, you look at a picture like Schindler's List that has a lot of nudity in it, but it's not particularly sexual in nature. It's showing you the graphic reality of what happened during the Holocaust, and so you have to take that into account. But so I think that you look at that, you look at content. Okay, this has language, this has violence. What type of violence? Sexuality. Adult content. But again, then you ask yourself, and you might have to read critics. There's some worthwhile critics out there reading some or worth reading. Some really good Christian critics. Alyssa Wilkinson, who now writes for Vox, she used to write for Christianity Today, is a great one. Stephen Gradanis, who's a Catholic, I think does some wonderful work. But they're going to give you some hints as to what's going on with the violence. Are they glorifying violence or are they not? Are they using language in a way that's just really vulgar? Or are they realistically representing some, real life situation, like maybe what goes on in war or something like that? And so I think we have to take those into consideration as well. What's this movie doing? What's its purpose? What's the story here? What's the value? And those are some, to me, that would be the first question I would ask is, what is of value in this movie? What's it trying to do? What's its overall purpose, instead of content? I wouldn't go to content first. I would go to content second. Now, if it's with my kids, I'm going to pay a lot more attention to the content. But I think, as you mentioned earlier, talking about having conversations after the movie is really important. So again, there may be a movie that doesn't have any bad content, but the message is horrible, that I might choose, I'm not going to let my kid watch this. But I may let my child watch a movie that has a little bit of objectionable content in it. And afterwards, we're going to have a conversation and say, hey, there were some bad words in that. And, we don't use that type of language as Christians. And the thing is, we can be naive about this, but they're going to encounter these words regardless. Mm-hmm. And I would I guess rather it be in a situation where I can have a conversation with them about it and explain to them why they're bad and why we don't use them, rather than them experiencing this language at school and me not being around and not being able to have that conversation with them.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up some specific critics and things like that, because there are so many tools that we have at our disposal, both for my own mind and heart, because I do want to guard my mind and heart and see things that have value, that are going to help me to process and think about and navigate my life. And then also for my kids and to sort of filter and evaluate what I let them watch. I really liked I really like the Plugged In online. It breaks down, and it even breaks down, spiritual content, positive elements, negative elements, and sort of helps to process, what's going to be good in the film, above and beyond just the content, language and violence and those kind of things. But it also helps break down those things and let you know exactly which bad words are in there and those kind of things. But another thing that my family does, and I don't know what you guys do, but we really like filtering because we like movies. I like the Marvel movies. I love the Avenger movies, and I want my kids to see them. But we don't go. I mean, just personally, we don't go to the movies and see it. But not for my boys anyway. My wife and I will go see a movie and we'll check it out. And then, if we think, hey, the story is great, we really want them to see this, but the language or violence or whatever needs to be filtered out. I mean, we really like VidAngel that filters out the streaming stuff. And then we have ClearPlay that filters the DVDs and Blu-rays and that kind of thing. So, there really are a lot of tools, both in critics and, just write-ups on different movies, and also filtering tools that help you to decide what your family does watch and what your family doesn't watch.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff out there now, more stuff than has ever been available. And so you mentioned some. Another one is IMDb. And so I use Plugged In, but IMDb, which is the Internet Movie Database, also does something similar. It's a little bit harder to find, but you can click on a movie and then drop down and see, what exactly is the content, and is this something that, I want to be watching? Is it something that's appropriate for my kids? And then everyone's going to have to make that decision. It's going to be different for everyone. There are things that affect us differently as individuals. I mean, one of the things that just really bothers me that I don't want to watch is when bad things happen to children, And sometimes movie makers can do that to manipulate an audience, and I just don't care to see any of that. I mean, it just really bothers me on a deep level, and so I just want to probably avoid those type of films.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up, I think that's a good kind of place to wrap up and land this plane, is just the idea of the individuality that goes into this decision making, that it's very hard to make any sort of blanket statements that say, hey, Christians shouldn't watch this, or every Christian needs to see. I see both, online. I see people saying no Christian should ever see this movie, or every Christian needs to see this movie, or whatever. And I think we got to be very careful when it comes to those types of statements. I think we all have to sort of evaluate ourselves and our own struggles and our own sensitivities, evaluate our families. And it's sort of a Romans 14 thing that we all have to come to a conclusion and do what we can do by faith and abstain from what we feel like we need to abstain from, and then not pass judgment on other people who make a different decision.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, I want to share with you 2 ways that you can help support what we're trying to do. The first is by rating and reviewing the podcast on iTunes or wherever you find your podcast to help others discover the show. The second way you can help is by checking out Logos Bible Software. Logos has partnered with us to give our listeners a great discount. So go to radicallychristian.com/logos, LOGOS. I think you'll love the software and you'll get a great discount by using that link. As always, I love you, God loves you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.